August 7, 1942, dawned with the thunder of naval guns echoing across the Solomon Islands as the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific War began, with a desperate gamble that would determine the fate of two empires. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's amphibious fleet approached the jungle-shrouded shores of Guadalcanal, carrying the 1st Marine Division into what would become the longest and most brutal campaign of the Pacific theater. The strategic importance of this remote island had become apparent to both sides following Japan's lightning advance across the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, the rising sun had swept across Southeast Asia with terrifying efficiency, conquering the Philippines, Dutch East Indies, and advancing toward Australia. The Japanese construction of an airfield on Guadalcanal's northern coast threatened to cut Allied supply lines to Australia and New Zealand, potentially forcing those nations out of the war entirely. Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift studied the intelligence reports as his Marines prepared for the landing. The enemy airfield, later renamed Henderson Field, represented more than just another military installation. It was the linchpin of Japanese expansion southward, a dagger pointed at the heart of the Allied Pacific strategy. Intelligence suggested approximately 2,300 Japanese personnel on the island, primarily construction workers and Korean laborers protected by a modest garrison. The pre-dawn bombardment shattered the tropical silence as cruisers USS Quincy Vincennes and Astoria unleashed their fury upon suspected enemy positions. The jungle canopy erupted in flame and smoke, while carrier aircraft from USS Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp swept overhead, strafing anything that moved. Yet beneath this overwhelming display of firepower lay a terrible uncertainty. Allied commanders possessed only fragmentary knowledge of Japanese strength and defensive preparations. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's Official Naval History, the struggle for Guadalcanal, the operation represented the first time American forces had taken the offensive against Japan, marking a psychological turning point as significant as any tactical victory. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, watched developments from his flagship with growing concern. The American assault on Guadalcanal violated his strategic calculations entirely. Japanese doctrine assumed the Americans would remain on the defensive for at least 2 years, allowing Japan to consolidate its conquests and prepare impregnable defenses. This premature Allied offensive threatened to disrupt the entire timetable for Pacific domination. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki commanded the initial Japanese garrison, a force woefully inadequate for defending the island, but typical of Japan's overextended position across the Pacific. The rapid conquest of territory had stretched Japanese resources dangerously thin, leaving many critical positions lightly defended, while the bulk of veteran forces remained committed to operations in China and Southeast Asia. The Marines hit the beaches at Red Beach with surprising ease, encountering minimal resistance as they pushed inland toward the airfield. The jungle seemed to swallow entire companies, while radio communications failed repeatedly in the dense vegetation. What appeared to be a textbook amphibious assault concealed the beginning of a nightmare that would consume both armies for the next 6 months, testing the limits of human endurance and revealing the true nature of Pacific warfare. August 20th, 1942, witnessed the first major Japanese counterattack as Colonel Ichiki's reinforced regiment launched a desperate night assault against the marine perimeter along the Ilu River, beginning a pattern of savage nocturnal battles that would define the Guadalcanal campaign. The clash revealed fundamental differences in military doctrine that would ultimately determine the campaign's outcome. Ichiki's force of approximately 900 elite troops from the 28th Infantry Regiment had been hastily transported from truck-aboard fast destroyers, part of what Americans would later term the Tokyo Express. These veteran soldiers, blooded in combat across China and Southeast Asia, possessed an almost fanatical confidence in their ability to overwhelm any American defense through sheer fighting spirit and superior night combat techniques. The Marine defenders, dug in along the western bank of the Ilu River, represented a new breed of American warrior. These men had trained extensively in amphibious warfare, but possessed no combat experience against an enemy renowned for tenacity and tactical skill. First Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines occupied the crucial river crossing, supported by hastily emplaced artillery and the venerable Browning machine guns that would prove decisive in the coming battle. The attack commenced at 0130 hours with the traditional Japanese battle cry echoing across the moonlit battlefield. Ichiki's assault troops, advancing in tight formations with bayonets fixed, expected to achieve the same shock effect that had served them so well in previous campaigns. Instead, they encountered a devastating crossfire from Marines who had learned valuable lessons from British reports about Japanese tactics in Malaya and Burma. Sergeant John Basilone, manning a machine gun position near the river mouth, became emblematic of American resistance during the 6-hour battle. His actions, later earning him the Medal of Honor, demonstrated how individual courage could multiply defensive firepower exponentially. As wave after wave of Japanese infantry charged across the narrow river, Basilone's gun crew cut them down with methodical precision, the water running red in the tropical moonlight. The supporting artillery, directed by Major Pedro del Valle, provided devastating enfilade fire that caught Japanese formations in the open. The Marine gunners, many fighting their first battle, discovered that their training in precision fire control gave them a crucial advantage over enemy forces accustomed to facing poorly equipped Chinese armies or hastily assembled colonial defenders. As documented in Richard Frank's comprehensive study, Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle, the Ilu River engagement demonstrated that properly trained and equipped American forces could not only withstand Japanese assault tactics, but destroy them completely. By dawn, Ichiki's regiment had virtually ceased to exist as a fighting force. Nearly 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the battlefield, their bodies testament to the futility of frontal assault against prepared positions defended by modern weapons. American casualties numbered fewer than 50, a casualty ratio that stunned both sides and forced a fundamental re-evaluation of Japanese tactical doctrine. Colonel Ichiki, facing the disgrace of total defeat, committed seppuku beside the Ilu River rather than report his failure to higher headquarters. His death symbolized more than personal honor. It marked the end of Japanese confidence in their invincibility and the beginning of a more cautious, defensive approach that would characterize the remainder of the campaign. The victory provided American forces with their first clear demonstration that Japanese forces could be defeated decisively when engaged under favorable circumstances, boosting morale throughout the Pacific theater and validating the strategic decision to launch offensive operations. September 12, 1942, marked the beginning of intensive aerial combat over Henderson Field as Japanese and American air forces clashed in daily battles that would determine control of the skies above Guadalcanal, transforming the jungle airstrip into the most contested piece of real estate in the Pacific War. The struggle for air superiority became the campaign's decisive factor, affecting every aspect of ground and naval operations. Major John Lucian Smith's Marine Fighter Squadron. 223 arrived at Henderson Field aboard USS Long Island, bringing with them the first Grumman Wildcat fighters to operate from the hastily completed runway. These pilots, fresh from training in the United States, faced the daunting prospect of engaging the legendary Mitsubishi Zero, a fighter aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. The Zero's reputation preceded it into combat over Guadalcanal. Pilots like Saburo Sakai had achieved remarkable success flying these nimble aircraft, shooting down dozens of Allied planes while seemingly immune to return fire. The Zero's exceptional range, maneuverability, and climb rate had made it the premier fighter aircraft of the early war, contributing significantly to Japanese air superiority throughout the Pacific. Captain Marion Carl emerged as one of Henderson Field's first aces, developing tactics that exploited American aircraft advantages while minimizing Japanese strengths. The Wildcat, though less maneuverable than the Zero, possessed superior armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and devastating firepower from its 650 caliber machine guns. Carl's experience revealed that American pilots could achieve victory through disciplined tactics rather than individual dogfighting skills. The Cactus Air Force, as Henderson Field's mixed collection of Marine, Navy, and Army aircraft became known, developed innovative tactics born from desperate necessity. Pilots flew multiple sorties daily, maintaining their aircraft with salvaged parts and improvised repairs while living in primitive conditions that would have challenged seasoned veterans. Japanese air attacks intensified throughout September as Admiral Yamamoto committed significant resources to neutralizing Henderson Field. The 11th Air Fleet, based at Rabaul, launched daily bomber formations escorted by Zero fighters, attempting to destroy American aircraft and render the airfield unusable. These raids, dubbed Tojo Time by American defenders, arrived with clockwork regularity each afternoon. As noted in Eric Hamel's detailed account, Guadalcanal, Starvation Island, the aerial battles over Henderson Field represented the first sustained combat between Japanese and American aviation units on relatively equal terms, revealing strengths and weaknesses that would influence aircraft development for the remainder of the war. The arrival of Army Air Force's P-400 Airacobra fighters under Major Dale Brannon added a new dimension to American defensive capabilities. Though poorly suited for high-altitude interception, these aircraft proved effective in ground attack roles, strafing Japanese positions and supply lines with devastating effect. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bauer's Marine Fighter Squadron 212 brought additional Wildcats and experienced leadership to the embattled airfield. Bauer's tactical innovations, particularly the development of coordinated bomber escort techniques, significantly improved American strike capabilities against Japanese shipping and installations. The cumulative effect of sustained air combat gradually shifted the balance of power over Guadalcanal. Japanese losses, particularly among experienced pilots, proved increasingly difficult to replace, while American pilot training programs began producing replacements faster than they could be consumed in combat. This attrition warfare, though costly for both sides, ultimately favored the United States due to superior industrial capacity and training infrastructure. By month's end, Henderson Field had evolved from a vulnerable outpost into a formidable airbase, capable of challenging Japanese control of the Solomon Islands, setting the stage for even more decisive confrontations. October 11, 1942, brought the first of several major naval engagements that would earn the waters off Guadalcanal the grim nickname Iron Bottom Sound, as American and Japanese fleets clashed in a series of nocturnal battles that tested naval tactics, technology, and human courage to their absolute limits. These encounters would prove that control of the seas around Guadalcanal was essential for victory on land. Rear Admiral Norman Scott's Task Force 64 approached the waters off Cape Esperance with a desperate mission: intercept Japanese reinforcement convoys that had been landing troops and supplies under cover of darkness. The American force consisted of cruisers USS San Francisco, Salt Lake City, Boise, and Helena, accompanied by destroyers Fahrenholt, Duncan, Laffey, Buchanan, and McCalla. These ships represented America's attempt to challenge Japanese dominance in night surface combat. The Japanese force under Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto possessed significant advantages in night fighting experience and equipment. Cruisers Ioba, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, escorted by destroyers Fubuki and Hatsuyuki, had spent years perfecting night combat tactics in waters around Japan. Japanese optical equipment, torpedo technology, and crew training all favored nocturnal engagements where their superior night vision and coordination could prove decisive. The Battle of Cape Esperance commenced at 23:46 hours when Helena's advanced radar detected Japanese ships approaching from the northwest. This engagement marked the first time American forces possessed a technological advantage in night combat, as their radar systems provided crucial early warning that Japanese forces lacked. Scott's tactical deployment, crossing the Japanese T formation, achieved the classic naval advantage that had decided battles for centuries. American guns opened fire at a range of 4,600 yards, catching the Japanese force completely by surprise. The cruiser Furutaka, struck repeatedly by American shells, began listing heavily as fires spread throughout her superstructure. However, the complexity of night combat soon produced confusion in both fleets. American destroyer Duncan, seeking to engage enemy vessels, inadvertently steamed between opposing battle lines and came under fire from both sides. The destroyer's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Edmund Taylor, maintained his attack despite devastating damage, embodying the aggressive spirit that characterized American naval tactics throughout the campaign. Japanese cruiser Ioba, Admiral Goto's flagship, suffered severe damage from American gunfire that killed the admiral and devastated the ship's command structure. This loss of leadership paralyzed Japanese tactical coordination at the crucial moment when decisive action might have salvaged the engagement. As documented in James Hornfisher's Neptune's Inferno, the Battle of Cape Esperance demonstrated that American technological advantages could offset Japanese tactical superiority in night combat, provided American commanders exploited their radar advantage effectively. The engagement's aftermath revealed both progress and persistent problems in American naval tactics. While Task Force 64 had achieved a tactical victory, sinking destroyer Fubuki and damaging several Japanese cruisers, coordination between American ships remained problematic. Friendly fire incidents and communication failures continued to plague American naval operations throughout the campaign. Japanese destroyer Fubuki's loss represented more than a single ship's destruction. It symbolized the beginning of American naval ascendancy in Pacific waters. The veteran crew's experience and tactical knowledge, accumulated through years of training and combat, could not be easily replaced as Japan's pool of skilled naval personnel gradually diminished. The strategic implications of Cape Esperance extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. American naval forces had finally demonstrated they could engage Japanese surface units on favorable terms, provided they maximized their technological advantages while minimizing exposure to Japanese torpedo attacks and superior gunnery skills. This victory boosted American morale throughout the Pacific theater while forcing Japanese naval commanders to reassess their tactics for future night engagements around Guadalcanal. November 12, 1942, witnessed the most savage ground combat of the entire Guadalcanal campaign as Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army launched a coordinated assault against the marine perimeter that would test both armies to their breaking point and determine whether American forces could withstand Japan's most determined effort to retake Henderson Field. The Japanese plan represented their most comprehensive attempt to destroy American forces on Guadalcanal. General Hyakutake had assembled over 20,000 troops, including veteran divisions withdrawn from combat in China and Southeast Asia. The 2nd Sendai Division, under Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, would execute the main assault against the southern perimeter, while diversionary attacks pinned American forces along other sectors. Major General Alexander Vandegrift's Marine defenders had spent months improving their positions, but remained outnumbered and faced critical shortages of ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements. The 1st Marine Division, reduced to fewer than 16,000 effective personnel by disease and casualties, occupied a defensive perimeter that stretched their resources to the absolute limit. The Japanese offensive commenced with intense artillery bombardment from concealed positions in the jungle surrounding Henderson Field. These guns, painstakingly transported through trackless wilderness and carefully camouflaged, delivered devastating fire that disrupted American communications and supply lines while inflicting significant casualties on exposed personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Herman Hanneken's 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines bore the brunt of the initial assault along what became known as Bloody Ridge. The Marines dug into hastily improved positions, faced wave after wave of Japanese infantry advancing through the darkness with fixed bayonets and distinctive battle cries that chilled even veteran defenders. The fighting achieved an intensity that shocked participants on both sides. Japanese soldiers, many weakened by weeks of jungle marching and inadequate supply, nevertheless pressed their attacks with fanatical determination. Marine defenders, firing from prepared positions, cut down attacking formations with methodical precision, while Japanese artillery and mortar fire devastated their ranks. Sergeant Mitchell Page emerged as the embodiment of American defensive tenacity during the crucial night engagement. His machine gun position, overlooking the primary Japanese approach route, became the focal point of desperate combat as enemy forces concentrated their efforts against this key strong point. Page's actions, earning him the Medal of Honor, demonstrated how individual courage could influence an entire battle's outcome. As referenced in Joseph Whelan's Midnight in the Pacific, the November battles around Henderson Field represented the climactic ground combat of the Guadalcanal campaign, testing the limits of human endurance under the most extreme combat conditions. The Japanese assault achieved initial penetrations of the Marine perimeter that threatened to split American forces and isolate Henderson Field from its supply bases. General Maruyama's troops, fighting with desperate courage, advanced closer to the airfield than any previous Japanese attack, forcing Vandegrift to commit his final reserves to contain the breakthrough. Marine artillery, directed by Major Pedro del Valle, provided decisive fire support that broke up Japanese formations before they could exploit their tactical advantages. The precise fire control and abundant ammunition available to American gunners contrasted sharply with Japanese artillery support, which remained limited by supply difficulties and communication problems. The battle's turning point came when Japanese forces, exhausted by continuous combat and lacking supplies for sustained operations, began withdrawing from their advanced positions. American counterattacks, spearheaded by Marine infantry supported by light tanks, recaptured lost ground while inflicting severe casualties on retreating Japanese forces. By dawn, General Hyakutake's offensive had failed completely. Japanese casualties exceeded 3,500 dead, while American losses, though significant, remained sustainable given their superior supply situation and reinforcement capabilities. The failure marked Japan's last serious attempt to retake Guadalcanal through ground assault. November 14, 1942 erupted in the most decisive naval engagement of the entire Pacific War as American and Japanese fleets clashed in the waters off Guadalcanal during a two-day battle that would determine the campaign's ultimate outcome and establish American naval superiority in the Solomon Islands for the remainder of the war. Admiral William Frederick Halsey, Jr., recently appointed to command South Pacific forces, had rushed every available warship toward Guadalcanal to intercept a massive Japanese convoy carrying reinforcements and heavy artillery intended to destroy Henderson Field once and for all. The approaching Japanese force represented Admiral Yamamoto's final gambit to retain control of the Solomon Islands through overwhelming naval power. The Japanese fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe, included battleships Hiei and Kirishima, light cruiser Nagara, and 14 destroyers. This powerful force carried a specific mission: bombard Henderson Field into uselessness while protecting a convoy of 11 transports carrying 7,000 troops and heavy equipment. The plan's success would effectively end American presence on Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's Task Force 67, built around cruisers USS San Francisco and Portland, represented America's desperate attempt to prevent Japanese bombardment of the airfield. Though outnumbered and outgunned, Callahan's force possessed radar advantages and the crucial element of surprise as they approached the Japanese fleet during the early morning hours. The first night's engagement commenced at 01:48 hours when opposing forces stumbled into each other in the darkness off Savo Island. The resulting melee, fought at point-blank range between ships moving at high speed, produced chaos that defied tactical control from either side. American and Japanese vessels fired at targets barely visible in the tropical darkness, while desperately maneuvering to avoid collisions and torpedo attacks. USS Atlanta, struck by both Japanese gunfire and friendly fire from San Francisco, became the battle's first major casualty. The light cruiser's destruction exemplified the confusion that characterized night surface combat, where identification of friend or foe remained nearly impossible until weapons opened fire at deadly close range. Admiral Callahan, commanding from San Francisco's bridge, maintained tactical control until a Japanese shell killed him along with most of the cruiser's command staff. His death deprived American forces of unified command at the battle's critical moment. Yet individual ship, commanders continued fighting with determination that prevented Japanese forces from achieving their bombardment mission. Battleship Hiei, subjected to concentrated fire from multiple American vessels, suffered severe damage that forced her withdrawal from the engagement. Though Japanese naval architecture emphasized armor protection and damage control, the cumulative effect of repeated hits from American cruiser and destroyer guns proved devastating to the battleship's fighting capability. As documented in Robert Lundgren's The World Wondered, the naval battle of Guadalcanal marked the first time in the Pacific War that American surface forces had successfully engaged Japanese capital ships and forced their withdrawal from a critical mission. The second night brought even more decisive results as Admiral Willis Lee's Task Force 64, centered on battleships Washington and South Dakota, intercepted the remaining Japanese force. Lee's ships, equipped with advanced radar fire control systems, engaged Japanese vessels at long range, where American technological advantages proved overwhelming. Battleship Kirishima, caught in Washington's radar-directed gunfire, suffered catastrophic damage that forced her scuttling later that morning. The loss of both Japanese battleships in consecutive nights demonstrated that American naval technology had finally achieved parity with Japanese tactical expertise in night surface combat. The engagement's strategic consequences extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japanese forces had failed to destroy Henderson Field, while their transport convoy, caught by American aircraft the following day, suffered complete destruction with heavy loss of life and critical equipment. January 4, 1943, marked the beginning of Japan's first major strategic withdrawal of World War II, as Emperor Hirohito's government secretly authorized the evacuation of remaining forces from Guadalcanal, acknowledging that the campaign had become an unsustainable drain on resources that threatened Japan's ability to defend more critical positions throughout the Pacific. The decision to abandon Guadalcanal represented a fundamental shift in Japanese strategic thinking. For the first time since the war's beginning, Japan had been forced to surrender territory that it had once conquered and held. The psychological impact of this retreat affected Japanese military planning for the remainder of the war, marking the end of offensive operations and the beginning of a desperate defensive strategy. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commanding the 11th Air Fleet from Rabaul, received orders to cover the evacuation of approximately 13,000 survivors from Lieutenant General Hyakutaki's 17th Army. These men, reduced to skeletal remnants of once proud military units, had endured months of jungle warfare, disease, and starvation that had destroyed their effectiveness as fighting forces. The evacuation plan, designated Operation K, required extraordinary coordination between Japanese air, naval, and ground forces. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto committed his remaining carrier aircraft to provide air cover while fast destroyers conducted nighttime evacuation runs that American forces dubbed the Tokyo Express. The operation's success would determine whether Japan could salvage anything from the Guadalcanal disaster. Major General Alexander Patch, recently arrived to replace the exhausted Marine units with fresh Army forces, commanded the final Allied offensive against Japanese positions. The 14th Corps, including the 25th Infantry Division and remnants of the 1st Marine Division, prepared to eliminate remaining Japanese resistance and secure complete control of the island. Japanese defensive positions had been carefully prepared to delay American advances while protecting evacuation beaches on Guadalcanal's northwestern coast. These positions, manned by soldiers who understood they were fighting a delaying action rather than a decisive battle, demonstrated the tactical skill that had characterized Japanese defensive operations throughout the campaign. The American offensive, launched on January 10th, encountered fierce resistance from Japanese forces who had constructed elaborate defensive positions using lessons learned from months of combat. Machine gun nests, artillery positions, and interconnected trenches created killing fields that extracted heavy casualties from advancing American infantry. As noted in Frank Maguire's The Last Stand, The Men Who Died at Guadalcanal, the final phase of the campaign demonstrated that even defeated Japanese forces remained dangerous opponents capable of inflicting significant casualties on overconfident attackers. Colonel Oka Akinosuke's forces, defending the Poha River line, exemplified Japanese defensive tenacity during the evacuation period. These troops, many suffering from malnutrition and tropical diseases, nevertheless maintained disciplined resistance that allowed evacuation operations to proceed according to schedule. The Tokyo Express destroyers, operating under cover of darkness, successfully evacuated the majority of surviving Japanese personnel during 3 separate runs between February 1st and 7th. These operations, conducted under constant threat from American air and naval forces, demonstrated Japanese naval skill and determination even in defeat. American forces, advancing against decreasing resistance, gradually recognized that their opponents were withdrawing rather than preparing for a final desperate stand. This realization marked a significant psychological victory for Allied forces, who had spent months fighting an enemy that seemed willing to die rather than surrender territory. The final Japanese evacuation occurred on February 7th as destroyer Isokaze departed Cape Esperance, carrying the last organized resistance forces. General Hyakutake, evacuated earlier due to illness, had witnessed the complete destruction of his army and the loss of Japan's first strategic defeat in the Pacific War. February 9, 1943, dawned over Henderson Field as the last Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal ended with a whimper rather than the expected final banzai charge, marking the conclusion of a 6-month campaign that had fundamentally altered the Pacific War's trajectory and proved that American forces possessed the capability, determination, and resources necessary to defeat the Japanese Empire. Major General Alexander Patch formally declared Guadalcanal secure at 1600 hours, ending a campaign that had consumed enormous resources from both combatants while establishing crucial precedents for future Pacific operations. The American victory represented more than territorial conquest. It demonstrated that Japan's defensive perimeter could be breached, and that the Rising Sun's military forces were not invincible. The human cost of victory staggered both sides. American casualties totaled over 7,000 dead and wounded, while Japanese losses exceeded 25,000 killed, wounded, or missing. These figures, devastating in their scope, paled beside the strategic implications of America's first major offensive victory against Japan. Disease had proven as deadly as enemy action throughout the campaign. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical infections had incapacitated thousands of soldiers on both sides, teaching crucial lessons about medical preparation for jungle warfare. American medical services, though initially inadequate, had adapted more successfully than their Japanese counterparts, contributing significantly to overall mission success. The technological lessons learned during the Guadalcanal campaign would influence American military development for the remainder of the war. Radar-controlled naval gunfire, coordinated air-ground operations, and amphibious assault techniques had all been tested and refined under combat conditions. These innovations would prove essential for subsequent island-hopping campaigns across the Central Pacific. Naval aviation had undergone a fundamental transformation during the campaign. The Cactus Air Force had evolved from a desperate collection of obsolete aircraft into a formidable striking force capable of challenging Japanese air power on equal terms. American pilot training programs, initially inadequate for Pacific conditions, had produced aviators whose skills matched or exceeded their Japanese opponents. Japanese strategic planning suffered irreparable damage from the Guadalcanal defeat. The loss of experienced pilots, naval personnel, and ground forces created gaps that could never be adequately filled given Japan's limited population and industrial capacity. More importantly, the psychological impact of defeat shattered Japanese confidence in their ability to win a prolonged war against American industrial might. As referenced in Richard Frank's authoritative study, Guadalcanal, the Definitive Account, the campaign's outcome validated American strategic planning while exposing fatal flaws in Japanese assumptions about American fighting capability and determination. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the campaign's results from his Pearl Harbor headquarters, recognized that Guadalcanal had provided the foundation for future Pacific operations. The lessons learned about amphibious warfare, air-ground coordination, and logistics would guide American strategy through the remainder of the war. The strategic implications extended beyond military considerations. American industrial production, tested by the demands of supporting forces 8,000 miles from the continental United States, had proven capable of sustaining major combat operations while simultaneously supporting Allied forces in Europe and North Africa. President Franklin Roosevelt, addressing the nation on February 15th, declared that Guadalcanal marked the beginning of America's offensive phase in the Pacific War. His words proved prophetic as American forces, emboldened by their first major victory, prepared for the island-hopping campaign that would carry them to Tokyo Bay. The campaign's legacy extended far beyond its immediate military results. Guadalcanal had proven that American democracy possessed the will and capability to engage in total war against a determined enemy. The victory provided hope to occupied nations throughout the Pacific, while demonstrating to neutral countries that the Axis powers were not invincible. Most significantly, Guadalcanal had established the template for Pacific victory. Overwhelming industrial production, technological innovation, and tactical adaptation would overcome initial Japanese advantages and carry American forces across the Pacific to final victory in Tokyo Bay itself.